Now, this is now the best way of fetching data in a Next.js application if you own the data source. So if you own the database, if you have an external API, you of course will need to send an HTTP request. But if you own the database, you can move it into your Next.js project and reach out to it like we're doing it here. Now, as I mentioned, the nice thing about SQLite and the package we're using is that it's actually a synchronous package and we don't even need to use async await. But I actually want to simulate a slower response here, and therefore I will actually turn this into an async function, even though the SQL package we're using would not need it. But I'll add async here, so that I can then await a new promise, which I only add here so that I can add a short delay, because I also want to show you how to handle loading states, for example. So this promise constructor gets a function as an argument, which automatically receives a resolve function. And then here I'll simply call setTimeout, and I'll set a timeout of 2 seconds, and resolve should be triggered after these 2 seconds. And I await this promise then. So this will make sure that we simply add a 2-second delay here to simulate a slower backend process or simulate a database that's slower. Because again, I want to show you how to handle loading states. With that, now that we're using async await here, getAllNews does no longer directly return an array of news, but instead it'll now return a promise which will eventually yield an array of news. Therefore, the code in the page.js file must be adjusted, because we can no longer call getAllNews like this. But that's no problem, because as I mentioned and showed you before already, you can decorate your component functions with async if they're React server components, which this one is. So hence we can simply add await here and we're good. That's all we have to do to fetch those news. If we now save that and reload, we still get that page with the news, but actually you will see that if you're on a different page and you reload there to make sure that Next.js loses its cache, and you click on news again, nothing seems to happen initially. And then only once the data is there do we navigate to this page. This does not happen thereafter because Next.js actually caches this page, but it happens during development if you reload some other page and then try to go back to news. And that's of course not a great user experience because it seems as if nothing's happening after clicking on news until we suddenly switch to that page. It would be better to show some loading fallback, some loading spinner or loading text or some skeleton loader until the data is there. And adding such a loading fallback, thankfully, is pretty straightforward in Next.js. You can add a special file called loading.js next to the page that is loading data or on a higher level, and Next.js will automatically show the content of the component defined in this loading.js file until the data is there. So here I can export my new function, news loading, or whatever you want to call it, and maybe just return this fallback text, though you could of course return any JSX content here, a loading spinner, whatever you need. Here I'll keep it simple and just return this loading text. And with this loading.js file added here, it'll take care of showing us this loading text if a sibling or child page is loading. So therefore now with that, if I go back to archive and reload and then click on news, we go there instantly and we see that loading fallback. And that's of course now a better user experience because now we got that instant navigation and we know what's going on. We understand that we're simply waiting for data. And that is how easy it is to add a loading fallback with Next.js.